Hello for my online full semester classes here in the summer of 2019. We're moving on now to Chapter 3, Federalism. This recorded lecture will be posted by the end of the first week, and certainly at the beginning of the second week, you should review this lecture and read Chapter 3 in your text. Roughly the schedule will be 2 chapters per week. So if you follow that, you'll be in good shape. There may be some weeks in which you actually need to at least begin reviewing 3 chapters. But usually about 2 chapters per week will put you in really good shape. Chapter 3, Federalism. So as we can see here, and you're looking at what federalism means and how it applies to our lives, you can see on page 78 of your text, throughout American history, lawmakers, politicians, and citizens have wrestled with questions about how responsibilities should be allocated across the different levels of government. So we have an ongoing quest, an ongoing struggle to try to determine what is the best way to use this government, and which, as we had in our discussion on Chapter 2, which branch of government should have the most authority and in what situation. Here we're looking at the debate on which level of government should have the most responsibility and in what situation should that occur. So here we look at the different levels of government in federalism, and which of those levels should have the most jurisdiction, should have the most power. And here we have a definition of jurisdiction: the power, right, or authority to interpret and apply the law. So, should it be the federal level that it should have the jurisdiction? In some settings, I'm sure we can consider that the federal authorities, in this case, Federal Bureau of Investigation, should have the most authority, should have the most jurisdiction. But there would be other situations, highway patrol in a state, in which the state police or the state authorities should have the most, it would be their jurisdiction. And there can be county areas. Think about the responsibilities of county officers, a county sheriff, for example. You could have a county sheriff that has, in bordering the land of a county, a different state, perhaps a different authority, such as a tribal land authority, and then even, in parts of our country, a different country, depending on the geographic location of a county. So there can be numerous areas of responsibility at the county level. And then also within the city. When should the city authorities have the most jurisdiction? For example, dealing with New York City, for example. So there could be times in which the city police would have authority, certainly within the jurisdiction of a city, over other levels of government. And there's been different occasions in our history in which particular laws, there's been debates and differences in the laws from one state or jurisdiction to another. And certainly there were times in which there were considerable differences on drinking laws among the different states. And so you could have a drinking age at 21 in one state and 18 in another state, differences on what forms of alcohol would be available in one state over another. And so that was certainly a time, and this would have been up until the late 1980s, that you would have seen those differences in drinking age among the states, and was certainly a time in which you saw federalism apply and choices being made among consumers among the different states. We saw Oklahoma being brought into a Supreme Court case looking at the issue of differences not only in age but in gender and became a lawsuit on the application of the 14th Amendment, which is oftentimes remembered as the Equal Protection Under the Law Amendment, and that there was not equal protection here by having an uneven drinking age in which women would be able to get alcohol at a younger age than men, and was viewed to be a violation of the Constitution. The Supreme Court agreed that it was a violation of the Constitution. So the way to get that drinking age up to 21 in all the states was based on requiring that if states did not raise their drinking age, and this happened while Ronald Reagan was president, that's why I have a picture of Reagan there, in the 1980s, 1984 to be specific, they did not raise their drinking age to 21, then they would not receive as much highway funding from the federal government. So it was a way of using funding to make the states change their policies. That's often a power of the federal government to be able to do things like that. We can see here also the issue of requiring states to recognize the laws of other states. And this is brought out in your text on pages 82 and 84 to look at contracts that have to be honored in one state over the other. And so we can certainly see the complexity of what might happen if you did not have something like the full faith and credit clause in your Constitution. You would then have the possibility of people leaving one state and not paying their bills as they go to another state. So if you owe and you're obligated to fulfill a contract, if a person is in that situation, they leave to go to another state, they must still fulfill that contract. So here we can see that reference to the drinking age law, and not specifically brought out in your text, but the issue of using money to influence state and local policy. And certainly the federal government probably does that more than any other level of government. A big part of that was brought out by the National Income Tax Amendment. This occurred during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Not that presidents directly vote on amendments, but they influence amendments a great deal in their authority, and that was the case there with Wilson in the 16th Amendment. So there's an ongoing area of debate on which level of government should have the most power or does have the most power. And so on this chart, you might want to spend some time looking it over, or you can find this in your text, but you can see the powers that are delegated to the national government, you can see the powers that are reserved to the states, and then you can see where there's shared power between the national and state governments. Now, we've seen some changes in the last 100 years or so with the use of the federal government and how it's changed our society. One of those areas has been in providing old age benefits, or what we generally refer to as Social Security. This is not really brought out in your text, but it's a landmark court case, as we can see here, Helvering v. Davis in 1937. That you could not have this unevenness in providing benefits at the state level. And the only way to resolve that unevenness was to have a national policy. And so an example here of when is it necessary to make decisions at that national level instead of the state or local level. And so again, a state-by-state basis, as we can see more and more older folks continuing to live on their own, and the benefits that that creates by having other forms of assistance, and now having people maintain an independent lifestyle and an independent income. That's brought out by these age-old benefits, or excuse me, old age benefits, and that they should be fairly similar from one state to the next. Now, when you come up with national policies, there's always the question about implementation. It's the same issue at the state level too. But I want to focus on that this is really dealing with a public policy aspect here and putting a policy to work, referred to as implementation. And so an education policy, a police policy, a military policy, all of those have to be implemented. And some are able to implement more effectively than others. Here's our textbook definition of implementation, and you can read about this on page 553. But it's a really good remembrance here that just because someone writes out a policy doesn't mean that it's going to be effective. What does it mean about those who have to carry out that policy? Have they been consulted? Do they know how effective that policy might be? And so some of the key aspects that are brought out about implementation: communication, analysis, and really being able to consider all costs and benefits. Is that actually possible? So a lot to be said there about implementation, and that's certainly brought up in federalism to consider which level of government is most equipped to deal with a specific issue. So there may be times in which you actually use multiple levels of government, or you come up with flexibility to be able to solve a problem. And that's brought out in the issue of cross-deputization. My guess is most of you taking this class live in an area where you see cross-deputization occur, or you may not even think about it. If you're in the state of Oklahoma, we see on many different areas cross-deputization involving law enforcement within tribal land, especially in casinos or venues that would have people around a casino, that you may then bring in law enforcement to help with the crowd and help with potential issues that might be occurring. And they're not tribal employees, but they would be cross-deputized to be able to handle that situation. And that's a way of looking at flexibility in federalism. Now, when we look at the different levels of government, we by and large see that some aspects of our society work with certain levels of society more than others. And historically, again, thinking of the state of Oklahoma, many of you perhaps taking this class have a history in your own family, in your own background of being American Indian, that you know of this tradition, that it's been the federal government that's really worked with the tribes, or perhaps not always worked with them, but dealt with them in the history here. So we probably see a group of people that are associated with the national government more than most people in our society right here in the state of Oklahoma. And that's brought out specifically in the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8, the Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So we can see here that one of the big issues about the federal government is money, and the ability then to transfer money from one level to the next. And so we have different forms of grants. Page 91, you can start to see this description here of various grants. Categorical grants, for example, very specific, a narrow purpose. And the grant proposals have to answer specific questions, as we can see here. One that's not really brought out in your text is the formula grant. Just like the name suggests, a formula is used to determine the amount of federal funds a state or local government will receive. Block grants have been used quite a bit, and there's plenty of levels of government and the people representing those levels of government that would like block grants because, as you can see here, there's fewer strings attached, less narrowly defined. You have more flexibility in how to use the money. This reference on the chart here on the slide is the Community Development Block Grant. This was used in Miami, Oklahoma a few years back now to transfer the shape of Main Street, Miami, and to widen the road and to now provide a 4-lane road in Miami. Some key court cases that are used. Here we have McCulloch v. Maryland, and a reference to the Commerce Clause in dealing with the issue of developing a national bank. And here we can see some of the ways of how that was found to be constitutional. So it was the power of Congress to be able to regulate commerce. Therefore, they can do that regulation through the creation of a national bank. Read about that on pages 87 and 88. And also, a considerable amount of power is given to Congress through the Necessary and Proper Clause, as we can see here, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. Pretty flexible, as it's suggested when you read through this chapter, that you can see ways of interpreting this to give considerable power to the United States Congress. And that banking system has been expanded to now have a Federal Reserve System and 12 district Federal Reserve banks. And as we can see here, they're responsible for adjusting the supply of money and ensuring that banks do not overextend themselves. So they do have a great deal of power in our banking system today. It's not as if everyone supported this, and perhaps in your history classes you've gone over this example, but here you have a case of Andrew Jackson. When he was president, he stopped the bank and did not want to have a United States bank. He believed that it gave too much power to unelected officials, and there are reasons to understand why he had that feeling. Should point out that once he ended the national bank at the end of his presidency and the beginning of the next president, Martin Van Buren, that took place after him, there was a tremendous economic downfall in the country. And so one of the questions is, by having a national bank, do you have a more stable economic system as a result? Even though it may mean that you're giving more power to people who have never been elected to any office. And that also we also have another case involving the Commerce Clause and interstate commerce, and looking at that question of what about a water system that goes between more than one state, and who has the power then to regulate that? Should it be up to a state to make that determination? Or should you again give more power to the national government? Is the national government going to serve as a referee in a way in those types of situations? So that's certainly the outcome that you can see in this case, Gibbons v. Ogden. So some of the explanations as to why the national government may have more power than states in particular cases. Look that over. look over this chapter, and certainly there are other factors that I didn't really go into detail here in this recorded lecture. So make sure that you make a note of that and what we have in the text. We'll be moving on then to Civil Liberties, Chapter 4, in our next recorded lecture.